ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו להדליק נר של חנוכה. אמן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שעשה ניסים לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה. אמן. מעוז צור ישועתי לך נאה לשבח תיכון בתפילתי לשם תודה נצווה.
Hanukkah light feels so right. 8 small flames shining through the night.
There's a law about Chanukah that I find moving and profound. Maimonides writes that the command of Chanukah lights is very precious, and one who lacks the money to buy lights should sell something, or if necessary, borrow, so as to be able to fulfill the mitzvah. The question then arises, what if on Friday afternoon you find yourself with only one candle? What do you light it as? A Shabbos candle or a Chanukah candle? It can't be both. Logic suggests that you should light it as a Chanukah candle. After all, there's no law that you have to sell or borrow to light lights for Shabbos. Yet the law is actually that if you're faced with that choice, you light that one candle as a Shabbos candle. Why? Listen to Maimonides. He says, the Shabbos light takes priority because it symbolizes Shalom Bayit, domestic peace. And great is peace because the entire Torah was given to make peace in the world. Now consider this. Chanukah commemorates one of the greatest military victories in Jewish history. Yet Jewish law rules that if you can only light one candle, Shabbos light takes precedence because in Judaism, the greatest military victory takes second place to peace in the home. Why did Judaism, alone of the civilizations of the ancient world, survive? Because it valued the home more than the battlefield, marriage more than military grandeur, and children more than generals. Peace in the home mattered to our ancestors more than the greatest military victory. So as we celebrate Chanukah, spare a thought for the real victory, which wasn't military but spiritual. Jews were the people who valued marriage, the home, and peace between husband and wife above the highest glory on the battlefield. In Judaism, the light of peace takes precedence over the light of war. Chanukah Sameach. Happy Chanukah.
Hanukkah light feels so right. 8 small flames shining through the night.
Eve Harow, Israeli tour guide, podcaster, and public speaker. Standing in MAALE LEVONA on the ridge of the Shomron, overlooking to the west, the sun that's about to set into the Mediterranean, and very soon we'll be backlighting what we think of, many people think of, as Israel proper, Tel Aviv, Yaffo, Haifa. There's a statement that was made many, many years ago in Yaffo that you're not going to find in the Tanakh. The story of Chanukah is not in the Tanakh, but we have 4 books of the Maccabees that were saved for us by the Christians. And the first book of the Maccabees was probably initially written in Hebrew, although we don't have the original version, by somebody who was in the army with Hasmonean, who was intimately familiar with Yehudah Maccabee and the battles that were happening. And one of the quotes from Maccabees 1, chapter 15, verse 33 and 34. ידועה תשובתנו של שמעון לשליח אנטיוכוס השביעי, שבא אליו בדרישות טריטוריאליות, Shimon the Maccabee answering the emissary of Antiochus VII, who says, what's with this territory that you have conquered? And he says to him, Lo eretz nochriya lakachnu v'lo b'rechush zarim mashalnu. We haven't come into a foreign land. We haven't taken over anything that belongs to somebody else. Ki im nachalat avotenu asher bidei oivenu be'et min ha'itim b'lo mishpat nichbesha. But we have come back into the land of our forefathers that was illegally occupied by our enemies without any kind of permission. And then when we had an opportunity, we came back home. Shimon says this in Yafo, a long time ago, minus 164, when the Hasmonean are finally able to battle back and win both religious freedom and political sovereignty in the land of Israel. Incidentally, the only time that we had political freedom from the First Temple period, probably from Chizkiyahu, we had about less than 100 years under the Hasmonean, and in 1948 in our modern times. The Hasmonean period was critical, and most of our history, our enemies have controlled the land, and we have stayed here. So what is ours? What is Eretz Yisrael? Some points in the Bible say, Mi Beersheva ve'adan. Other times not in the Bible, in different periods, like the Persian period. It's just Yerushalayim and Greater Yehuda, more or less Gush Etzion of today. Where Eretz Yisrael is where we are. It's where we've conquered, it's where we've resettled, it's where we've replanted both our food and our children, and are once again learning Torah and holding Jewish lives and the rhythm of the land and the rhythm of Judaism. That's where the land of Israel is. And what Shimon said so long ago is still very relevant for today. Where we have sovereignty, where we are, is the land of Israel. Something to remember. Some things never change.
Is there another nation on God's earth which has got a stronger claim to a tract of land, to a country, than the Jewish people's claim to the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael? And this is a religious claim, a historic claim, a moral claim, and a legal claim. Let's unpack each one of these very briefly. Religiously, the Jewish people and Judaism has been tied to this land since time immemorial. The very first time that God spoke to the very first Jew in Parashat Lech Lecha was indeed to Abraham, to journey to the land that he will show him, the land of Canaan, the land that would become Eretz Yisrael. And twice over in two separate covenants, spiritually binding legal covenants from a religious point of view. Brit Bein Abtarim, the Brit of the Peace, is the covenant of the peace, and Brit Milah of circumcision were primarily around the right of Abraham promised by God for his progeny who would come out of the Jewish people to the land of Eretz Yisrael. A religious claim reinforced from the time of the first Jew through every single generation since time immemorial. Secondly, historically, as I said, the very first time that Hashem spoke the first Jew, and indeed the first Jewish families and people, their lot and destiny was always tied to this land. There is no other nation on earth today, no other people, which has strong a connection to any land, other than perhaps the Chinese. To their land have been around since antiquity, but no other nation, other than the Chinese and the Jewish people, descendants, of course, of the children of Israel, which have a claim to a land. And no other nation certainly has a claim to Eretz Yisrael going back 3,000 to 4,000 years. Morally, it wasn't so long ago during the Shoah that when the Jewish people were being persecuted throughout Europe, as we know, such a tragic part of our history, and the pogroms which came before, that when the Jews were trying to go and leave and go to places which would take them, that many countries allowed very few Jews in and closed their quotas, and many did not let Jews in at all. And ships, as we know, went from harbor to harbor, people returning to find their fate in Nazi Europe. And therefore, the only one country that has always opened its doors to Jews without quotas remains the state of Israel. The one country and the one land that the Jews have always had a connection to and called their own. Morally responsible. This is the only place to accept them and absorb them no matter what the circumstances from all places around the world. And finally, of course, the legal claim. This year, 2020, is the 100th anniversary since the San Remo conference, in April of 1920, which laid the foundations eventually of the League of Nations and all the major powers in the world which agreed to legally give Eretz Israel to the Jewish people. All of Arabia and Syria and Mesopotamia were given to the Arab nations and the Muslim nations, but the nations agreed to give Eretz Israel to the Jewish people, reinforced time and time again in subsequent agreements. As the famous diplomat from England, Lord Curzon, called it, he said that San Remo is the Magna Carta of the Jewish people and their connection to the land of Israel. So I say in conclusion, Chanukah time, when it was Shimon Maccabee 2,300 years ago that you just heard about from Eve Harow saying to Antiochus' representative, Lo Eretz Nochria Lakachnu, we didn't come to take anybody else's land. It has been the land that we have claimed as our own, more than any other nation, from a religious, historic, moral, and legal point of view. What a zchut that the Jewish people have returned collectively to the land of Israel today.
Hi, this is Ambassador Friedman, and as requested by the World Mizrachi Organization and Rabbi Tarragon, I'm happy to share with you a few thoughts about the importance of the land of Israel to the Jewish people. In a nutshell, the two are inseparable. The Bible, of course, is replete with references to the land of Israel. God promised it to Abraham. He freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt to bring them to the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And he made clear that the consequence of the Jewish nation turning away from God would be expulsion from the land. Ezekiel the prophet foresaw God restoring the Jewish people to their homeland, and for 2,000 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, Jewish prayer has sought exactly that. Not only did God promise this land to the Jewish people, but the Bible recounts that the two holiest places in Judaism, Yerushalayim and Hebron, were actually bought and paid for by King David and Avraham, respectively. David was offered Jerusalem for free, but insisted on paying for it to fully establish his rights to the location. And Abraham even overpaid for the Cave of the Patriarchs, Marat HaMachpelah, so there would be no doubt that this burial place would belong to his descendants forever. I will always be amazed by the first comment of Rashi on the Torah. He asks why the Torah recounts the story of creation. Why not just begin with the first mitzvah, which appears in the book of Exodus, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem? He answers, and remember that this is in the 11th century, almost 1,000 years ago. He answers that the entire creation story is recounted solely to establish God's ownership of the world, and thus God's ability to grant legal title of the land of Israel to the nation of Israel. Rashi anticipated, again, almost 1,000 years ago, that other nations would contest the rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and the story of creation, according to Rashi, gave the Jewish people an ironclad title policy. They could persuasively claim that the land was given to them by God. Rashi's words ring true now more than ever. The nation of Israel, the faith of Israel, and the land of Israel inextricably are intertwined. This is something that makes Israel unique among the nations. Chag Chanukah Sameach to all of you. May God bless you, may God bless Israel, and may God bless the United States of America.